Introducing Opera GX, the browser that doesn't play. You ever feel like you're being watched, followed, hunted by ads that refuse to leave you alone? With Opera GX's ad blocker, you take control, silence the noise, cut through the digital darkness. No more stalkers, just pure, uninterrupted browsing. But why stop there? With Opera GX's built-in VPN, you can vanish completely. Unseen. Untraceable. Your privacy. Your rules. But for those who dare, Opera GX has something far darker. Forget boring, lifeless browsing. With GX mods, unleash your twisted imagination. From chilling whispers to creaking doors that should have stayed shut, welcome to your own personal nightmare. Customize everything. Your themes, your sounds, your fonts, your icons, even your browser splash screen. Opera GX, the browser that dares to go where others fear to tread. Use the link in the description to download now.
Arok, do not speak, Colonel. Conserve the strength that still resides in your flesh. The Iron Hands warrior bared his teeth at a munition-ripped sky. His helm had been savaged by an autocannon 2 hours ago. He had ripped it off, revealing pale flesh puckered by augments and bionics. Fully half of his face was mechanical, a strangely perfect vertical bifurcation of skin against iron. The metal pitted, the flesh scarred and bleeding. The vertical split continued down to his limbs. He carried Colonel Naris with his bionic arm, metal fingers digging into her chest plate and hefting her with ease. He leapt from the rocky outcrop with his bionic leg. The ground shuddered as he completed his disjointed advance. Arok, leave me. Do not speak. Two screaming fanatics rushed at him with rusted knives. Their flak armor was soiled with bloody tokens of their heathen god, their flesh spoiled by gruesome sores of hardened gore. The blood layer's sheen was thick enough to stop a las round. Against the hammer blow of a transhuman Astartes, however, it was like paper. Arok swung his weapon in a wide upward sweep. He hit so hard that the hammer passed through the torso of one traitor and obliterated the skull of the other. The parts of them that were left were flung back, blessedly quiet. Ripples of las fire whipped out from a half-cratered trench. Arok grunted as rounds snapped against his armor. He dropped the hammer, allowing it to maglock to his waist as he quick-drew a black sheen bolter. He fired with one hand. The recoil was so great that even he couldn't keep it entirely steady. But a series of mass-reactive rounds exploded 3 chests and covered his approach with a haze of blood and thrown-up dirt. Arok jumped into the trench. He used his bolt gun as a club, cracking one skull before gunning down another 3. He turned. A las round whispered along his cheek, burning transhuman flesh down to the ceramite-infused bone. Arok replied with a contemptuous burst of mass-reactive fire, blowing the gunner to pieces and killing the fool who stood behind them. Another traitor ran at him, howling as he drove a bayonet into his side. The blade failed to pierce the power armor, and Arok punched him with the bulk of a bolt gun. His blow caved in their face and snapped their neck with a horrible crack. With that, the enemy broke. Arok carefully placed Colonel Naris onto the ground. His other hand now free, he took careful single shots, systematically butchering the rest of the traitors before they made it to the corner of the trench. Arok! The Marine grimaced, the expression lopsided around his half-human face. He shot the Colonel a frustrated glare. Naris smiled back at him, blood dribbling from her lips. One hand was held to the crater in her side. The other was gone, along with an arm that had been blown off 200 meters back. What are you doing, Arok? I am bringing you to safety. Naris tried to laugh, managing a pained wheeze. I think we're going the wrong way. Arok grunted. The 93rd did well. We are too far from the defensive line. The only way was forward. Is that Martian logic? Medusan logic. Naris wheezed again. I'm dying, Arok. Good. That means you are still living. Arok scanned up and down the trench, weighing his options. They were badly exposed. It was only a matter of time before the counterattack came. Hundreds of caterwauling heretics taking their chance to bring down a solitary angel of the Emperor. Where are your brothers? 2 clicks east, avoiding the worst of the anti-armor before making their direct assault. No doubt cursing my name with every breath. You came alone? For me? Do not die, Colonel Naris. The guardswoman smiled. As she opened her mouth, a curtain of blood slopped down her chin. You big softy. Arok did not respond to the teasing. We will hold here. Take cover best you can. You'll have to move me. The Iron Hand obliged. He gently picked her up, nestling her in the shallow dugout made by a stray artillery round. Naris coughed. Blood poured over her hand. 2 lines of approach. Not ideal. It is not. But we will hold. The Iron Hand ejected his half-empty clip and slammed in another. He waited, listening to the cacophony of not-so-distant battle. They had charged through the worst of it, dodging bombardments, mortar shells and zipping bullets, but Arok knew that they only had a temporary reprieve. He gritted what remained of his teeth. The screaming shells of Earthshaker cannons flew overhead towards the Imperial position. When my brothers arrive, we will silence that artillery. That's good. The Marine frowned. The Colonel's voice was faint. But before he could turn back to her, the enemy was upon them. They came from both left and right. Arok sent a burst of mass reactive death in one direction, before spinning to deliver it in the other, grimacing as las rounds whipped around him. Naris had been right. 2 lines of approach was less than ideal. He spun back and forth, delivering mechanical bursts of fire that tore men to pieces and sent others scattering back, strewn in the guts of their former comrades. He killed dozens, but the enemy kept coming. The weight of lasfire finding the joints in his armor and burning the exposed skins of his helmless face. He felt his skin slough off the bone, his cheek punctured by a series of rounds that ricocheted around his mouth and scorched the teeth within. The machine spirits in his armor grimly reported 6 breaches. He felt each one, but he kept firing. He made piles of the enemy, heaps of shredded skin and unformed limbs, exploded torsos and blood-mist heads. Still more came. In the end, the insane zeal that had sent them charging into bolter fire was the same madness that spared Arok from death. The traitors were not content to kill with their lasguns alone. They were desperate to gut and butcher the Astartes with the intimacy of bayonets and knives, and kept pushing forwards, blocking their lines of fire. The trench filled with bodies, intact and broken. The weight of lasfire lessened. Arok stood in cover made from human flesh. The Marine spent his 3rd clip. He let the bolt gun mag snap to his waist and drew his hammer. His first sweep obliterated the skulls of 2 traitors. His second slammed into the carapace of a blood-caked officer and caved in their chest. Then they were upon him in earnest, pressed too closely for the weapon's full reach. Arok spat acid in the eyes of a screaming fanatic. He took another's head with his bionic arm and crushed their skull beneath his iron grip. He let the hammer slide through his hand until its head rested against his fist, using it as an adamantine knuckle duster that he put through a trachea. Knives and bayonets scratched and scraped across his armor. Gunmetal grooves cut into the matte finish black. He kicked another traitor to the chest, sending them like a rag doll through ranks of advancing heretics. As the horde stumbled and fell, he punched out with his hammer, cracking a flak chest plate in half and shattering the ribs beneath. He backhanded another enemy with his bionic hand, splintering their jaw into pieces. A madman stabbed up at his face with a red-stained combat knife. With no room to evade, the Iron Hand instead headbutted the blade, ignoring the impact pain as his ceramite-treated skull bent the metal and sent the weapon flying from the traitor's hand. He spat acid into their howling face. Still they kept coming, driven by the madness of the damned. Arok punched and kicked and spat, a cornered beast thrashing against a swarm of rats, a cliff face battered by an ocean storm. He was bleeding. a dozen shallow wounds clotting over to Laraman cells, his second heart pumping adrenaline and muscle-boosting stims into transhuman limbs. He headbutted, gouged, crushed, but above all, he killed, surrounding himself with the bodies of the treacherous fallen, a mountain path of broken limbs rising to his chest. It was hot with sweat and spilt blood, stinking of gore and iron, wet with entrails and slopping bone. The thunder of death and furious screams was suddenly overcome by a stormbolter's roar. Mass reactive rounds scythed through the mob, a knife cutting through preservative. A red aftershock of V-type paint followed the bolts of the reaping weapon, accompanied by the growling doom of sustained bolter fire. The Physaline stench of detonating bolts mingled with the twin scents of slaughter and voided bowels. Arok felt the press of bodies lessen. The enemy's morale collapsed. One moment, the horde was a slavering mob of blood-hungry fanatics. The next moment, it was a terrified crowd of fleeing, defeated vermin. It was like someone had flipped a switch between insanity and horror, driving the enemy into a new kind of frenzy. They fought and stumbled over each other to escape, pushing, trampling, killing. Arok grimaced. He wiped away the gore across his face, feeling every wound that dented and scored his armored body. He turned to the Rhino APC. The vehicle was punctured in a score of places, one track sitting at an uneasy, slight angle to its spokes. His brothers jumped down into the trench network. Their guns were blazing. No mercy was offered to the traitors. No respite. The dust cleared. The blood haze fell. The Physaline reek lingered. Sergeant Obana stomped towards Arok. He was a juggernaut of augmented iron, his voice contaminated by the timbres of the machine.
Arok, you forced our hand.
Your timing is impeccable, Obana.
Did you forget that you're a soldier of the Iron Hands?
Arok felt his blood boil at the implied insult. He forced the emotion down. I apologize, Sergeant. There was limited time for coordination. Obana grunted. It sounded like the grinding gears of an old machine.
If you are to be insubordinate, it would be better to be honest.
The Astra Militarum made an abortive push. Only the 93rd avoided disgrace. Their reward was to be abandoned, their flanks exposed. I decided to act. Obana said nothing to that. He glanced to the broken body of Colonel Naris. Arok resisted the urge to position himself between them. When I reached them, the 93rd was all but lost. I located Colonel Naris and extradited her from the killing zone. She is a military asset. It would have been illogical to leave her behind.
Your appeals to logic are disingenuous, brother.
Nonetheless, the sergeant angled his head over his shoulder.
Move! The Rhino is exposed, and we must not lose the initiative.
Arok obeyed, carefully lifting the mortal woman and cradling her to his chest. Her eyes were closed, her breaths weak and shallow. She needs an apothecary.
Her well-being is not a priority. Logic dictates that we capitalize on our strike and destroy the enemy artillery placements.
Arok gritted his teeth. The human side of his face was a patchwork nightmare of lacerated flesh and bullet-hole skin. Obana stared back at him. His bionic eyes flashed, piercing even the baleful green of his helm's visor.
If she is still alive when we return, then you may waste your time on any sentimentalities you choose.
Arok nodded, not rising to the insult. He hastened for the Rhino. The sooner the artillery was dealt with, the sooner they would return to base. The Rhino limped past the frontline trenches, smoke curling from its engines. Its tracks made an awful rattling sound, its armor scored with heavy bolter craters, but still it ran. It sputtered its way to the back line and delivered the Iron Hands home. The Marines filed out. Their armor was scored with las rounds. Claw had lost his hand to an errant bolt round, the stump of his left hand a mangled nightmare of bloody tissue. All bore injuries of one kind or another, but they lived. The iron endured. Arok ran from the APC, roaring for a medic. Mortal soldiers quailed at the anger in his voice. Some outright fled, overcome by transhuman dread. Others pointed, and the Marine stormed forwards, the broken body of Colonel Naris still clutched in his arms. The other Iron Hands watched him go. Their contempt was hidden behind their helms, but Arok felt it nonetheless. A sister of the Order Hospitalis stepped out to greet him at the Medicaid tent. Her arms were covered in blood up to her elbows. Her right arm was underslung with a gore-strewn bone saw, its chainsawed teeth still flecked with the dust of severed bone. She smiled at Arok. Eyes alighting with mad fervor, she gestured the Marine inside. The Medicaid tent was a grim affair. Arok felt his neuroglottis activate to the infection reek, his pulse quickening to the stench of blood and gore. Men and women of the Astra Militarum screamed as sisters amputated limbs without anesthetic. Others groaned and moaned as they slowly succumbed to an infection's rot. Supplies were low. The Departamento Munitorum resupply was behind schedule by some weeks. Arok took this all in and more in a matter of moments.
Her name is Jane Norris. She is the colonel of the 9th Company. She must survive.
The sister with the gleaming eyes bowed deeply, interlocking her bloody fingers in the sign of the Aquila. She gestured to her bed. Arok set the colonel down. He watched as the sister performed her art, stomach sinking at the extent of the colonel's injuries. The missing arm was bad enough, but the hole in her stomach was grotesque. Flaps of bloody skin barely holding in ripped-up intestine guts. Her skin was so white that it seemed to belong to a corpse. In his heart, Arok knew that Jane Norris could not be saved, and yet the sister attempted to perform a miracle, as the angel had commanded. Gore-clogged servitors stumbled forwards, walking blood infusions that lent their vitae to the colonel's pale flesh. The sister fastened a tourniquet to what was left of the soldier's destroyed arm, amputating another inch and filling the clean cut with a puffy skin gel. She gestured another servitor, clicking her tongue in a strange cant as the lobotomized servant staggered to a locker and brought back bionics, the components of an augmetic viscera to replace the ruination of the guardswoman's guts. Arok went to speak, but caught himself and remained silent. He let the sister work. She injected the colonel with a corpsifying compound. Arok heard the colonel's heart rate slow. He ground his teeth. The sister began the process of removing the guardswoman's intestines, matter-of-factly reaching into her abdomen and spooling out tubes of flesh. She used medical scissors to cut Norris open further, discarding stinking digestive organs into a slopping bucket. Her eyes focused, her nose barely wrinkling, the sister began replacing the colonel's insides with bionics, repairing her digestive system wholesale. It took hours. Arok kept vigil throughout. He ignored the eyes of others upon him, the awe on the faces of dying men and women. He was an angel of death in their midst. Many wept to see it. Others died with prayers on their lips. By the time the surgery was finished, night had fallen. The sister looked both haggard and elated, her hands slick with blood, oil, and waste product. She washed them in a dirty bucket of gory water and stepped back from the Iron Hand with bowed reverence. Arok looked down at the sister's work. Jane Norris was alive. That itself was a small miracle. Her right arm was still missing, but the ruined stump now ended with a thickened skin gel. The puffy substance collapsed into a hardened layer. Her stomach had been replaced with a patch of solid metal, fused to the flesh by adhesive gel, hiding the intricacies of the bionics within her guts. Her skin was still pale, but it regained some of its color. 2 grey-faced servitors having shut down after giving everything they could offer. The colonel was alive, but was comatose. Despite the sister's efforts, it remained unlikely that she would ever wake. Arok didn't need the sting of his neuroglottis to know that the risk of infection was high. The flesh was weak. There was nothing more he could do, but Arok maintained his vigil. He stared down at Jane Norris, waving away the attempts of the sisters to treat his facial injuries. His eyes tracked the shape of the soldier's mouth, the shallow scar across her lips. He willed the soldier to open her eyes. He wanted to see the purple of Arcadian irises one more time. He stirred at the sound of commotion, registering the stomping gait of one of his brothers. He did not need to turn around. He recognized Claw by the beat of his twin hearts and the subtle idiosyncrasies of his walk.
Claw, how is the hand?
The flesh is less than weak. It is gone, but in its absence, I will be perfected.
Arok turned to behold his brother. Claw was the youngest in their squad, having risen from the trials of the Iron Moon mere decades ago. He had a pugilist's frame, his nose bionic from where he had broken its fleshy equivalent after headbutting through an orc knob's skull. Besides that, only his left hand was bionic, for now. The right hand would soon follow.
"Do you need me for something, brother?"
Claw smiled thinly.
"I had wondered what mortal had captured your attention so thoroughly that you would oversee her medical treatment and not mine."
"I knew you would be well."
"Will she?"
"The surgery was successful."
"Hygiene standards appear lax."
"The sisters are hard-pressed after the aborted assault."
"Yes. I hear it was an abject failure."
Arok clenched his jaw. He took Claw's arm and led them both outside.
"You will compromise their morale." "What morale? All but your favorite company broke and ran."
Claw sneered.
"They are cowards. I'd heard that the Cadians were better than this."
"They are still human."
"Yes. So why do you care about this one?"
"Colonel Naris is an exemplary soldier."
"She is little more than a corpse."
Claw exhaled in sharp surprise as Arok gripped him by the vambrace. He growled dangerously, but did not fight back.
"You forget yourself, Arok."
Arok snarled. He relented, stepping back. Claw regained his footing and narrowed his eyes.
"This sentimentality is a weakness. Twice you act rashly against your brothers."
"Our intervention transformed failure into Pyrrhic victory. The assault failed, but the Cadians now have artillery supremacy. The next assault will do better."
"You are not my sergeant. This was not your tactical assessment to make."
"You are not my sergeant either, and Obana is more than capable of administering discipline without your help." Arok sighed. "Forgive me, brother. I should not have laid hands on you." Claw scoffed.
"Especially as I only have the one. You owe me a hand, Arok."
"Please, as if you're not delighted by its amputation. You should thank me for its loss." Claw chuckled.
"That might be too far."
Arok smiled too. "Forgive me, brother."
"It is forgiven. The flesh is weak."
"The flesh is weak." Arok knelt at the colonel's bedside. His hands were interlocked, iron and flesh. A passerby might have mistaken him for praying. Jane Naris was dying. The infection rot had spread across her guts, riddling her from the inside out. Her face was slick with sweat, her breaths short and haggard. The sisters had tried to make her comfortable, to give her dignity, but there was never dignity in death. She was a moist carcass waiting to die, and no matter how many sponge baths they gave her, she still stunk of fever and diarrhea. Arok bowed his head.
"This folly must end, brother."
Arok grunted at Sergeant Obana's voice. "She yet lives."
"She should have died days ago. You wasted bionic material on her broken body and transformed a worthy death into something wretched."
"You are trying to provoke me."
"I am not. I want you to learn from this. Look upon her and see what you have wrought. Reflect on the failures of logic that have led to this pitiful display."
Arok felt his jaw clench. When Obana placed an iron hand on his shoulder, he shrugged it off.
"Arok."
"I do not need your compassion, Obana, even if you had any to give." The sergeant produced something like a mechanical growl.
"So be it. Wallow in this mortal's death. Suffer as you have made her suffer, and embrace the weakness of your flesh. But do not take too long, lest you find your brothers gone once you remember you are Astartes."
Arok listened to his sergeant clomp away. He nursed anger to his twin hearts. Over the next hours, he felt it calcify into something very much like hate. By then, he was decided. It was not difficult to requisition a shuttle. He was an angel of death, a son of the Emperor. The requisitions officer treated his words as if they were given by the throne itself. Arok was disconcerted by how easily he circumvented military protocol, but he soon put it from his mind. The keys had begun to turn. Now committed, the Iron Hand would follow it through to the end. The bulk lander approached the Oryx with mechanical sluggishness, the ship opening its bay in acceptance of Arok's access codes. Obana would soon learn that Arok had returned to the Iron Hand's vessel, but Arok reasoned that his sergeant would not think much of it. Obana was trying to teach him a lesson about sentimentality. Like Arok, he would allow the situation to play out in full. A grim smile came to Arok's lips. Obana did not realize how far Arok was willing to go. The sergeant's logic was flawed. The Iron Hand brought the lander down in the bay, menials with the blessing of iron shuffling towards them. One with the machine god, the servitors had long been cleansed of their flesh personalities, their existences given over to the perfection of mechanical purpose. They did not question the orders that Arok gave. They simply obeyed. They acted as Jane Naris's pallbearers. Arok walked at the front of the procession. The Oryx was a Spartan machine, bearing little in the way of decoration. There were no banners or victory laurels to adorn its barren halls, simply chemically treated walls to preserve against the corruptions of rust. The occasional chapter sign accompanied the symbols of the cult Mechanicus over doorways leading to particularly important components. But even this felt like an afterthought, a mechanical clearing of the throat. The Iron Hands honored the machine through deeds. Not for them the pomp and ceremony of the other first founded. Not for them the triumphal marches of the Ultramarines or the savage feasts of the Space Wolves. The Oryx was unadorned, but it was fiercely functional. It was barren, but it was clean and well maintained. Like the chapter itself, it was an efficient machine. But even the most efficient machine had its weaknesses. The Oryx was too trusting of its Marines. It could not scrutinize Arok's intent as he used his codes to access the ship's vaults. And so the Marines' funerary procession passed into the dark heart of the vessel, unchallenged and unopposed. The vaults were dungeon and forge, librarious and hold. The lumens were dim. The gloom pervaded across crates of ammunition and quietly whirring cogitators. That darkness extended along the underdecks of the vessel, where feral servitors roamed and cannibalized, and the rats grew as large as dogs. Even on an Astarte ship, these bowels were wild and desolate places. The dregs left to their own devices on the strict understanding that they did not steal from or inconvenience the Iron Tenth. Like this, the ferals and mutants had become another line of defense. They guarded the ship's secrets with a terrified fanaticism. They would die for the Oryx and the Iron Hands. They policed their own, crucifying their thieves, desperate to ward away the fell purges that lingered as generational trauma and long-dried rivers of blood. Even the feral servitors respected the property of the Astartes. Something in their diseased brains recognized the angels of the Omnissiah and offered obsequence. Arok led the funerary procession deeper into the vaults. They navigated a series of biometric checkpoints. Figures moved in the darkness, their scuttling echoing from walls of iron. Whatever it was, they avoided him, terrified by the possibility of his wrath. The Iron Hand led the procession to the gate. It was not a physical gate. There were no iron bars or spiked columns of steel. But, for all that, it was no less imposing. The chamber was arranged as an ancient smithy, a metal block serving as both anvil and mortuary slab. Tools of vivisection and mechanization waited on a featureless iron shelf, curiously clean of cobwebs or dust. A cogitator sat nearby, ritualistically imprisoned under heavy linked chains. That cogitator was the true gate, a doorway into hell itself. Arok directed the servitors to rest the colonel on the metal slab. He paused to briefly place his hand against her lips. He stepped towards the cogitator. Arok could feel its silken motive force thrumming through its terminals. It wanted to awaken. A bead of lumen threaded across the monitor. An access key had been thrust into the terminal, serving as activator rather than some rune of ignition. Arok grunted at the symbolism. His bionic hand lingered above the key. He hesitated. He glanced back to Jane Naris. His transhuman ears heard the unsteady faint pulse of her blood. Arok looked back to the gate and turned the keys of hell. He didn't know how long it had been. It felt like days. He wondered why his brothers had not come to find him. Logically, there could only be one reason. They had not come because the Iron Tenth had been called to war, and Arok had been absent. He had abandoned them.
I will return, brothers. I am sorry.
His mind buzzed with forbidden lore. The Oryx's gateway to hell was shallow, giving access only to the highest infernal planes. But still, the data was intoxicating and heady. Any mortal would have been overwhelmed. Arok merely struggled. He was no Iron Father, but he was a son of the Gorgon. He understood many mysteries of the Martian cult. He held a scalpel made for transhuman hands, large enough to be wielded by a mortal in battle. Arok used it to cut into the guardswoman's diseased flesh. The stink of infection activated the Marine's neuroglottis, tasting of morbidity and decay, of hopelessness and despair. Arok traced the scalpel around the plate of the guardswoman's bionic stomach. The metal squelched when he lifted the plate from her body, weakly clawed at by the tendrils of necrotic skin. The stink worsened. Arok's nostrils flared. He beheld bionic organs, intestines and stomach, porous, flexible tubes of a plascrete and iron alloy. The Colonel's flesh had rejected the invasion of Mars. Her insides inflamed where the artificial met the biological, infection spreading across her diaphragm and towards her reproductive system. Arok did not need an acolyte of the Sisters Hospitaller to know that it was fatal. Her body was broken. Jane Naris would die, but for the gifts of hell. Arok swallowed. He began his fell work. It commenced with mutilation. He rolled the Colonel onto her front and then cut 2 lines along her spine, flaying her to reveal the exposed muscles of her back. These Arok cut away as well. Blood flowed at a terrible rate, barely matched by transfusion machines that coughed oxygenated vitae into the guardswoman's dying body. Her heart had already stopped. The machines pumped for her. The Marine scraped the remnants of muscle from Colonel Naris's spine. He cauterized the tangled ends of the circulatory system with a tiny solder. With a chisel, he carefully broke the joints between the spinal bones and used a brush to skim away the dust. It took hours, but when he was done, he was able to gently lift the spinal cord from the ruination of the guardswoman's body and feed the nerve tissue into a shallow tank of oxygenated fluids. Next, Arok turned to the Colonel's skull. He shaved her head and used the medical blade to peel open her scalp, returning to the chisel to fracture the bone beneath. He placed a spreading clamp in the fissure, slowly rotating the screw to force open the wide pads and crack open the skull. The guardswoman's head opened like the pages of a book, flopping dismally against the metal slab. Beneath was the thin grey film of outer brain tissue, and Arok sliced his way inside. He reached out with his bionic hand to lift up Colonel Naris's brain. He delivered it to the oxygenated hygiene tank. All this had taken many hours. Arok paused and beheld what he had wrought. Colonel Naris's brainstem and spinal cord sat in an isolated tank, fed an artificial cocktail of oxygen and other vital fluids. The rest of her lay face down on the metal slab, flayed and dead. The iron hand swallowed at the butchery he had performed, the mutilation of Jane Naris by his hand. It was too late to go back now. He sent for Medicae servitors, trusting in their ability to repair mortal flesh. He directed them to the Colonel's body, overriding their confusion through a series of crisp, binary commands. He watched as they rotated the corpse onto its back, removing necrotic tissue and replacing oxygen-starved organs with a full panoply of bionics. They scooped out her insides and replaced them wholesale, replacing infected skin with fresh leathers, stitching her back together. As they worked, Arok turned his attention to the Colonel's brain. Following the instructions of the cogitator by rote, he took hundreds of picked scans from every side, building a comprehensive image of the dissected tissue. The gate did the rest. Arcane programs greedily consuming the data and spitting out its myriad instructions. Parts to be severed, parts to be replaced, parts to be repaired. Arok balked at the exactness of the surgeries he would have to perform, but he could do nothing else than trust in the precision of his bionics. He would rely on the steadiness of iron. He sent for the bionics that he needed. They were rare, extremely rare, but the serfs of the vessel did not dare gainsay him. He was an Astartes. He was an Iron Hand. They did not realize that even an angel could fall into darkness. He performed the operations on the brain as the servitors worked on the Colonel's front, replacing her internal organs and restoring through iron that which had been lost to decay. He worked with minuscule tweezers and scrapers. A spidery fusion of mechanisms and biological tissue began to take form. An arachnid's web of glinting technology meshed with sticky grey matter. Once more it was a painstakingly complex task, swallowing more and more time. Still his brothers did not come, but Arok had forgotten them. He would remember them only when he had returned to the world of the living, only when he had returned from the moors of hell. He finally finished and laid down his tools. The blessed of iron were already done. They stood at dead-eyed attention. He held aloft the reconstructed brain that had once belonged to Jane Naris and returned it to the augmented cage of her flesh. Arok sank the organ into the flayed book of her broken head. He clasped her skull tight, using adhesive to close her tissue but for the sliming, thrumming tail of her brainstem and spinal cord. That he rested down the muscle-stripped wasteland of her mutilated back, reconnecting what he could to her circulatory system. Then he stood back and allowed the Medicae servitors to do the rest. He felt as if he had aged centuries. The Iron Hand watched as they brought forth gears and coils, reconstructing the musculature of her back. He watched as they trapped their inner workings of the machine within plates of protective metal, soldering, stitching and binding with flesh gel to the skin of her shoulders and lower back. That skin had already begun to discolor. The Colonel had been dead for at least 2 days now. Arok paused at that. At first he might have convinced himself that these treatments, these experiments, were some form of unorthodox Medicae, a desperate attempt to halt the growth of infection and the decay of the weak flesh. But as time had passed, his mind immersed deep within the swamps of hell. Such self-delusion had become untenable. This was no mere Medicae. This was technological necromancy. This was cyber-resurrection. He clenched his jaw, the metal of one side of his face straining at his gritted teeth. He had been told that such science was best forgotten. It had been locked away. It had been forbidden by a father he had never known and had predeceased his birth by thousands of years.
You were weak, father. You were as flesh and we were sundered. We shall never be as flesh again.
Arok reached for the motive actuators. He placed their cold pads against the iron of Jane Naris's back. He squeezed the triggers and watched as the motive force imbued her with life anew.
Life is directed motion. The motive force is directed by the Omnissiah. Thus, the Omnissiah grants life.
The Colonel twitched, convulsed. A mechanical groan whirred through the machines that made up most of her musculature and internal organs. Arok kept the triggers of the motive actuators compressed, directing more and more into the guardswoman's corpse.
Sentience is the ability to learn the value of knowledge. The soul is the conscience of sentience and can be bestowed only by the Omnissiah. Omnissiah, bestow this child of iron with the conscience of sentience.
He swallowed.
Return what was taken. Bestow onto her the soul.
Jane Naris shuddered. Her elbows bent as she planted her hands against the table and pushed. She forced herself back to her feet. Arok stepped back. He did not know fear, but combat stims flooded his system, his transhuman organs misinterpreting the resurrection as a deadly threat. He let the motive actuators clash to the floor. The Colonel spoke. Her voice was changed, ravaged by the grip of Hell's machines.
Arok.
Jane?
Arok. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
She took a shuddering step forward. The Iron Hand heard no heartbeat in her chest, just the clockwork of whirring gears and new bionics.
I can't breathe. I can't. I don't.
You don't need to breathe.
I can't. Why can't I? I can't feel.
Be calm. You will feel as the machine feels. What death has taken has been replaced and augmented.
Death? What have you done?
You are returned. I have brought you back.
No, Arok. I can't. Oh God! Oh Emperor, what have you done?
Arok moved towards her, trying to steady her uncertain movements. She pushed his arms away.
There is... What?
Let me help you.
Arok, there is something else. I can't...
Be calm. Remember who you are. You are Colonel J. Naris of the 9th Company of the Cadian 214th. You are a guardswoman of the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard.
No, I'm not.
You are. Arok gripped her by the shoulders. A thrum of rage almost overtook him, the anger of frustrated desperation. He resisted the urge to shake her, staring into her eyes. The purple irises were gone. They had been replaced with bionics. Those bionics stared back at him, mechanical and cold.
I am more. I am less. I am different. I am dead. I should not be here.
You are Colonel Jane Naris of the 9th Company of the Cadian 214th. Jane, that is your name.
I can't breathe. I can't feel. What have you done? What have you done? What have you done to me?
In a sudden movement, the Colonel took Arok by the throat. Her hand squeezed with murderous force on his windpipe. Arok let out a gargled cry. His neck tensed in instinctive resistance. Her grip was now the grip of iron. Post-human. Dangerous.
What have you done to me? What have you done to me? What have you done to me?
Arok staggered back, metal hand still around his throat. He tried to push her off, to get her to relinquish her grip, but her iron hands were too strong. Too strong.
What have you done to me? What have you done to me? What have you done to me? What have...
She went limp. Her hands fell from Arok's neck. Her neck was snapped, rotated almost 180 degrees. Arok let go of her head. Jane Naris collapsed to the floor. The Marine fell to his knees. He sobbed like a heartbroken child.